France just realized it can't control Africa anymore, and the continent's response was brutal enough to send shockwaves through European capitals. In a stunning display of defiance that fundamentally reshapes the balance of power in West Africa, the Alliance of Sahel States, led by the charismatic and uncompromising Ibrahim Traoré, delivered what they're calling a final warning to Emmanuel Macron and the European Union. This isn't just another diplomatic spat. This is the moment when an entire region decided that centuries of external control are officially over. For decades, France has treated the Sahel like its own private backyard. It controlled the currency. It dictated policy. It extracted resources while the region burned under the weight of terrorism and instability. But something changed. Something that Washington, Paris, and Brussels never saw coming. And now, the entire geopolitical chessboard in West Africa is being rewritten before our eyes. Let's rewind to where this tension actually began. To understand why Traoré and the Sahel are drawing a line in the sand right now, you need to understand what came before. For generations, France maintained an almost colonial grip on its former territories across West Africa. It wasn't just military bases and trade agreements. It was a kind of control that dictated elections, shaped policy decisions, and ensured that France's interests always came first, even when those interests directly conflicted with the survival of the Sahel itself. The terrorism crisis that has ravaged Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger over the past 2 decades, that was happening on France's watch. Thousands of civilians were being killed. Entire communities were disappearing. But France was so focused on maintaining its geopolitical dominance and securing uranium access for its nuclear industry that it treated the security crisis as a secondary concern. The narrative was always the same. France was there to help, to bring stability, to fight terrorism on behalf of a region that supposedly couldn't do it alone. But the people of the Sahel saw something different. They saw hypocrisy. They saw exploitation disguised as altruism. Then came the military coups. In Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, one by one, young military officers took control and made it clear they were rejecting the old order. The first shock was Niger in 2023. Then Mali doubled down on the same message. Then Burkina Faso did the same. And suddenly, France found itself on the outside of governments it had spent billions trying to control. This wasn't a gradual shift. It was seismic. And it terrified the European establishment. Here's where things get interesting. And here's what the European narrative completely misses. When the EU and France began criticizing these new leadership changes in the Sahel, they were operating under an assumption that had always worked in their favor, that they could pressure these countries into compliance. Macron and Brussels believed they could use diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, and the threat of sanctions to force the Sahel back into line. They thought the same playbook that had worked for 60 years would work again. They were catastrophically wrong. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's military leader, didn't play along with the script. Instead, he and the Alliance of Sahel States responded with a counter-narrative so powerful that it exposed the entire Western diplomatic strategy as hollow and desperate. In a stunning reversal of roles, Traoré turned the tables and accused the West of being the real problem. And the accusations were devastating in their specificity and truth. The Sahel leaders didn't just push back against criticism. They reframed the entire conversation. They highlighted decades of Western hypocrisy in the region. They pointed out that France and Europe had extracted uranium, timber, and countless other resources from the Sahel, while the region suffered under terrorism and economic collapse. They emphasized that Western intervention has consistently prioritized Western interests over regional security. They noted that even as thousands of Africans were being killed by terrorist groups, France was far more concerned with maintaining political control and resource access than actually solving the security crisis. And most damaging of all, they were right. But that's not the full story. The Sahel leaders went further. They didn't just criticize the past. They declared the era of Western control officially over. This is crucial to understand because this moves beyond rhetoric into actual geopolitical restructuring. The Alliance of Sahel States made a clear statement. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will now defend their own sovereignty. They will build their own military alliance, one without French troops, without European oversight, and without the colonial strings attached. This declaration terrified European capitals for very specific reasons. First, there's the uranium factor. Niger is one of the world's top uranium producers, and France depends on it for its nuclear industry, which provides most of France's electricity. The idea that France could lose reliable access to Niger's uranium reserves is existential to the French energy sector. Second, there's the geopolitical leverage. The Sahel sits at the crossroads of African migration routes, terrorism financing, and regional stability. Losing influence there means losing a crucial foothold in global power dynamics. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, it's about the narrative. If the Sahel succeeds in expelling Western forces and building independent security solutions, it becomes a model that could spread across the entire African continent. What happened next changed everything. The European response exposed just how desperate they'd become. Rather than engaging with the legitimate grievances of the Sahel states, Europe doubled down. There were threats of sanctions. There were accusations of human rights violations designed to delegitimize Traore and the new leadership. There were attempts to use international pressure to force political change. But every single move backfired because the Sahel had already shifted its narrative. They weren't defending themselves against European criticism anymore. They were attacking the credibility of the entire Western diplomatic apparatus. And here's where the really interesting part emerges. Traore and the Sahel leaders weren't just responding to immediate pressure. They were sending a message to the entire African continent. They were essentially saying, "Look at us. We stood up. We said no. And instead of being invaded or economically destroyed, we're building alternatives. We're taking control of our own destiny." For nations across Africa that have felt the weight of Western control, whether economic, military, or political, this was revolutionary. This was proof that the era of submitting to external pressure might actually be ending. The military alliance that the Sahel countries are building isn't just a defensive move. It's a fundamental restructuring of power in the region. By pooling their military resources and creating an integrated defense system that doesn't depend on Western support, they're creating something that Europe can no longer control. Russia has sensed this opportunity and has moved quickly to fill the void. We've seen Russian military advisors and mercenary groups move into the region. We've seen arms deals. We've seen political support. While France was lecturing about democracy and human rights, Russia was offering something far more valuable: military hardware without the moral lectures, without the conditions, without the colonial baggage. This is where the geopolitical significance becomes truly global. The Sahel isn't just a regional story anymore. It's part of a much larger pattern we're seeing around the world. From the Middle East to Central Asia to Southeast Asia, we're watching nations increasingly push back against Western pressure and seek alternative partnerships. Some align with Russia, some with China, some build regional coalitions. But the pattern is consistent. The unipolar moment where Western countries could simply dictate terms is genuinely ending. And the Sahel is becoming one of the most visible examples of this shift. What happened next changed everything. And it reveals the real desperation behind European diplomacy. When sanctions were threatened, the Sahel didn't beg for mercy. When France suggested pulling its troops, the Sahel said yes, please do. When the EU warned of isolation, the Sahel found new partners. The script that France had relied on for decades, the script where African nations needed Europe, feared European withdrawal, and would ultimately capitulate. That script was torn up and thrown in the trash. But here's what's crucial to understand about why this moment matters so much. This isn't just about France losing influence or the EU losing leverage. This is about a fundamental question that will define the next decade of geopolitics. Will the global system continue to be organized around Western dominance, or will it reorganize around regional powers and new alignments? The Sahel's defiance suggests the answer. And it's terrifying Washington and European capitals because they don't have a good strategy to respond. The European playbook has always been the same. When countries don't cooperate, threaten sanctions. When they don't change course, increase the pressure. When they still don't comply, lecture them about democracy and human rights. But this playbook only works when the target nation actually needs the Western support. It only works when there are no alternatives. In the Sahel, both of those conditions have changed. These countries have alternatives now, and they don't need Western support nearly as much as the West needs their resources and their strategic location. What happened next revealed something even more important. The way Traore and the Sahel framed their defiance wasn't just practical. It was ideological. They weren't just saying, "We don't want your troops here anymore." They were saying, "We're rejecting the entire framework of Western dominance over Africa." They were tapping into decades of resentment about colonialism, resource extraction, and Western hypocrisy. They were connecting to a Pan-African narrative about independence and self-determination that has deep historical roots. And they were doing it at a moment when that narrative is resonating across the entire continent. This is the part that really frightens Western strategists. Because if this narrative spreads, if other African nations start asking the same questions about Western presence, Western deals, and Western resource extraction, the entire architecture of Western influence in Africa collapses. And that would be seismic. Africa represents enormous strategic value. Raw materials, agricultural potential, demographic growth, and crucial geostrategic positioning between Europe and Asia. Losing influence there would represent a genuine shift in global power dynamics. The speech from the Alliance of Sahel States wasn't just a political statement. It was the opening salvo in what could be a much broader realignment. The question isn't whether France can negotiate its way back into the good graces of Sahel leaders. The question is whether Western nations can adapt to a world where they don't get to call the shots everywhere, all the time. And based on the European response so far, the answer seems to be no. They can't. They don't know how. Here's what the European media won't tell you, and what makes this story even more consequential. The Sahel's defiance is happening at a moment when the entire Western geopolitical position is weakening. Ukraine has drained European military resources. Economic troubles have undermined European leverage. China is making major investments in Africa. India is building influence. Russia is filling every gap. In this environment, the Sahel's decision to go its own way isn't just a regional issue. It's part of a global recalibration where Western dominance is being actively challenged and dismantled in real time. But that's not the full story. Because Traore and the Sahel are also walking a tightrope. Building military independence, yes. Rejecting external pressure, absolutely. But these countries still face real threats. Terrorism in the region remains a genuine security crisis. Economic development is desperately needed. Infrastructure is lacking. And while Russia and China might offer military and political support, they're not offering the same level of economic investment or development aid that Western institutions provide. The Sahel is essentially saying, "We can survive without you." But can they actually thrive? That's the real test ahead. What happened next is critical to understanding where this goes. The European response has been increasingly desperate because they understand, on some level, that they're losing. The accusations of human rights violations coming from Brussels, they ring hollow when Europe has supported far worse regimes elsewhere when it served their interests. The warnings about Russian influence, they sound weak when Russia is offering actual support while Europe offers ultimatums. The lectures about democracy, they fall flat when it was European support that maintained dictatorships for decades when those dictators were aligned with Western interests. The Sahel leaders understand this. That's why Traore's message resonated so powerfully. He wasn't just defending Sahel sovereignty. He was exposing the fundamental hypocrisy that has always been at the heart of Western diplomacy. The West talks about democracy and human rights and the rules-based international order. But what it actually does is maintain systems of control and resource extraction wherever possible. And when those systems break down, it tries to reinstall them through pressure, sanctions, and threats. The Alliance of Sahel States has fundamentally shifted this conversation. They've made it clear that they see through the rhetoric. They're not going to be bullied into compliance anymore. And they're building alternatives that make Western pressure less effective. Whether those alternatives ultimately serve the interests of ordinary Sahel citizens better than Western partnerships is a separate question. But from a pure geopolitical standpoint, this is a genuine disruption to the existing order. This brings us to the question that keeps strategists awake at night in Washington and Brussels. If the Sahel successfully consolidates its independence, what happens when other African nations start demanding the same thing? What happens when West Africa joins the Sahel in rejecting Western pressure? What happens when the pattern spreads across the continent? The answer is that Western influence in Africa, which has been significant since colonialism formally ended, would be fundamentally reduced. And that would be one of the biggest geopolitical shifts in a generation. The European response to all this has been instructive. Rather than genuinely engaging with the Sahel's grievances or offering meaningful partnership, they've doubled down on the old playbook. More criticism, more pressure, more warnings. It's like watching someone try to use a key that no longer works and becoming increasingly angry that the lock has changed. The Sahel has changed the lock, and the West hasn't figured out how to adapt. Here's what makes this moment truly historic. We're watching the moment when a region of Africa, having experienced centuries of external control and extraction, is consciously choosing to build something different. Whether it works, whether it delivers security and prosperity to ordinary people, whether it succeeds long-term, those are all genuine questions. But the attempt itself, the willingness to say no to Western pressure and build alternatives, is itself a watershed moment. It shows that the old system of Western dominance, while far from completely dismantled, is no longer invulnerable. Cracks have appeared. Alternatives are emerging. And the people in the Sahel have decided they're not willing to be controlled anymore. The broader implication of Traoré's final warning is that the West has exhausted its options in the Sahel without achieving its objectives. The moment for gentle pressure or quiet pressure has passed. The moment for coercive diplomacy is ending. The Sahel has made its choice, drawn its line, and is now building alternatives. From Paris to Brussels to Washington, there's a growing recognition that the era they thought would last forever, the era where they got to decide the rules, might actually be ending. And they have no plan for what comes next. As we look forward, the question becomes, is the Sahel an anomaly, or is it the beginning of a much larger shift? Are we watching a one-off rebellion by a particularly assertive regional leader? Or are we watching the opening chapter of African reemergence as a force in global politics that doesn't ask permission from the West? The way the Sahel's message has resonated across Africa, the way other nations are watching and learning, suggests that this might be much bigger than just Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. This could be the beginning of a genuine realignment in how Africa relates to the rest of the world. And for those of us watching global power dynamics shift in real time, that's the real story here. Not just that France lost control of the Sahel, but that a region that has been under various forms of external control for centuries finally said enough. They drew a line. They built alternatives. They rejected the old rules. And when the West tried the old pressure tactics, those tactics failed. That's not a small thing. That's a signal that the old world is ending and something new is beginning. The only question is what comes next.